Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Ms van Vessenhuizen. Now, who do you have for us this morning, please?
My lord, we have this morning Ms Bradley, who is the General Secretary of the Educational Institute of Scotland, or EIS.
Very good. Good morning, Ms Bradley.
Good morning, my lord.
Very good. Now, Ms van der Vesterhuizen will have some questions for you when you're ready, Ms van der Vesterhuizen.
Thank you, my lord. Ms Bradley, please could you confirm your full names?
My name is Andrea Bradley.
And you gave a witness statement to the inquiry. My lord, that witness statement can be found using reference number WT0774. Ms Bradley, you're the General Secretary of the EIS, and you've held that role since May 2022. Prior to that, you were Assistant Secretary with the departmental responsibility for education and equality, and were in that role, I understand, from August 2015. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Could you please outline very briefly what those two roles entail in general terms, and also with reference to the pandemic, please?
Okay. So prior to May 2022, I was an Assistant General Secretary to the then General Secretary, and during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was offering direct assistance to the General Secretary in matters related to provision of education, curriculum assessment, pedagogy, and also advice to the General Secretary around equality matters as they impacted on staff, our members, and also as they may have impacted on children and young people, who were the students and pupils of the members that we have enlisted to our membership. Since May 2022, I have been acting in the capacity of General Secretary. Officially, I took up the role on the 1st of August 2022, but really from the point at which I was appointed, I was undertaking lots of the duties of the General Secretary, and the General Secretary has overall strategic responsibility for the union. Works very closely with the lay leadership of the organisation, commonly the executive committee of the EIS, and effectively we're a trade union and a professional association. We were founded in 1847 with dual aims, one of those being to advance the interests of teachers, but at the same time to promote sound learning, and 177 years later, that's still what we do. We care about teachers as the providers of education, teachers and lecturers, but we care very much about the quality of the experience that children, young people and adult learners have when they're in our education establishments, and the outcomes that they acquire from that experience.
Thank you very much. You've preempted part of my next question, which was going to ask you to tell us a bit about the role of EIS as a trade union, including its aims, but I think you've covered that. So if I could ask you, please, just to give an outline of the makeup of its membership, please.
So the EIS represents members in all sections of education, from early years all the way through to higher education, and we represent teachers at all stages of career. So in the school sector, that would be student teachers, probationer teachers, all the way through to head teachers, even some directors of education would be our members. We represent 80% of teachers in the school sector. We represent almost all college lecturers within the FE sector, and we represent in the region of 1,500 members in the university sector, so quite an expansive range of education interests that we are looking after in terms of our membership cohort.
Thank you. And what is the total number of members?
So today the total number is something in the region of 63,500 members. At the time of the pandemic, I think it was maybe just a little bit lower than that, but in the region of 60,000 at the time of the pandemic.
And what was the reason, or is it known what the reason for the increase in the membership was since the pandemic?
I think probably to some extent the very good work that the EIS did in support of members over the pandemic, would maybe have encouraged others to join. But I think that the recent pay campaigns that we've run have also encouraged members to join. And I think that when trade unions actively engage their members, they're more likely to recruit them in the first place and to retain them, once they have signed up for membership. So I think it's testament to the strength of our union as an organising union, and as a union whose staff and lay leadership work very closely together to maximise member engagement and participation in our work, which really helps sustain what we do and grow what we do.
Thank you. And I think in paragraph 30 you refer to, you say your members are overwhelmingly women. And what percentage of your membership are women? In
the school sector, in the region of 80%, just short of 80% of our members are women.
80%?
Yeah, just short of 80%, around about 77 or so percent, yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll move on first to have a discussion about school closures and the issues and impacts around that. We'll come on shortly to discuss issues around prevarication and delays in terms of reaching agreement on circulars and advice in advance of school closures, which you discuss in some detail in your statement. But could I ask you first to describe some of the main anxieties and concerns that were expressed by EIS members in the weeks leading up to the school closures on the 20th of March, please, 2020?
So there was really intense personal and professional pressure on teachers, school staff, instrumental music teachers, head teachers and deputy head teachers in the weeks immediately leading up to school closure. They were doing, the job, any of those jobs are complex at the best of times, but with growing anxieties about the risk of COVID infection, teachers and other school staff being very cognisant of media reports about what was happening internationally, what was happening in Europe, what was happening in other parts of the UK. Anxiety was growing about the safety of schools and the potential for schools as very, very busy environments to be breeding grounds for infection. So at that time, as well as doing all the things that teachers and school leaders would normally be doing, they were also trying to manage infection risk and their own growing safety concerns, and indeed those of children and young people and families about this looming threat of COVID. Just before the closure of schools, there was anticipation that schools might be closed. So there was anxiety around how the shift from in-person within classrooms based learning was going to be made to some kind of remote provision, and that was unprecedented really in the school sector. Nothing like that had ever been undertaken before, and there were lots of questions and anxieties around how that would practically be done, how that would be managed, with actually pretty limited resources and not a lot of time to put into the planning, while also teaching classes and doing all the things that are required to support children and young people on a daily basis. There was maybe a lack of clear direction also from COSLA as the umbrella body of local authority employers of teachers. They seemed to be, kind of dragging their heels, really slow to come to national agreements around how all of this could be properly and sensibly managed, and that really contributed rather to the kind of spikes in anxiety that teachers experienced, worrying about, security of employment if we did move to online provision, or security of salary if we did move to online provision, and how safety matters were going to be handled in the interim. So there were a whole range of anxieties there. Pregnant staff in particular were anxious about the potential harm to themselves as pregnant women and to their unborn babies. People with underlying health conditions, as they were hearing more about, how the virus was impacting on certain groups, were becoming anxious about themselves, if they had particular health vulnerabilities. And then many teachers are also parents, and many of them are parents of children with underlying health conditions, and they were aware that they were in very busy environments that didn't really have, at that point, sufficient mitigations in place to manage infection risk. So they were worried about the impact of that on their families and other people that they were in contact with at home. So I would say that there was a real fear amongst teachers just about immediate safety of themselves and close family members and particularly those close family members who may have carried the kind of vulnerabilities that were being highlighted in the media as a matter of real concern. Thank you. And you've touched on the delays that
COSLA delays, and you say at paragraphs 14 to 16 of your statement, where you suggest that prevarication and delays, particularly on the part of COSLA, in failing to agree circulars and advice timelessly contributed to variation between authorities. Sorry, I'll let them get there. Between authorities, meaning that the safety and implementation of key risk mitigation measures were not as uniform as they ought to be. And then you say in paragraph 19, you go on to say that the EIS had been pressing for an agreement covering emergency arrangements at the Scottish Committee for Teachers, and that a sign-off from COSLA had not been received. Please, could you explain what EIS wanted and why, and what the reasons were for the delay on the part of COSLA, if known?
So whilst schools had never had to grapple with something of the magnitude of COVID previously, they had to take account of swine flu a number of years previously, and there were provisions around emergency arrangements to manage the risks that swine flu presented, which we believed could easily have been used as a template to make sensible provision to counteract the risks of COVID. And there was a real slowness on the part of COSLA to engage meaningfully in the work that needed to be done to make the template fit for purpose in the in the here and now of COVID, and really maybe a failure on their part to grasp the seriousness of the public health risk that we were as a country facing, and that the school sector in particular was trying to grapple with. So this was around things like adjustments to class size arrangements, teacher class contact arrangements, what the health and safety provision should be while the risk of COVID infection was such as it was, we were anxious about the amount of time that it was taking, given that infection levels were rising daily, and the number of deaths was rising daily, and our members could see all of that unfolding in media reports and in the pages of various national newspapers. So that was a matter of real concern. Yeah, that was a matter of real concern.
And just in terms of the concern that mitigation measures were not as uniform as they ought to have been, why was there a concern on the part of EIS to have uniform mitigation measures across local authorities?
Because we very much would see it that a public health crisis that spans the whole country has to have a national response, and whilst there might have been particular local circumstances that would have required maybe adaptation or something additional to what was being provided within a national framework, we did think that national framework should have been there. And if teachers who were pregnant were being safeguarded to an acceptable degree in one local authority, we believed that they should have been safeguarded to the same degree in another local authority, and that shouldn't have been down to postcode. And when members saw that their colleagues in some local authorities were being afforded certain provisions because the employer in that local authority was more sympathetic to the needs of those teachers, who had particular vulnerabilities, they felt aggrieved and very perplexed as to why they were not receiving the same considerations and accommodations within their local authority area. We didn't think that really matters pertinent to immediate health and safety should really have been up for that kind of local negotiation or local interpretation.
Thank you. And I think you've already answered what the consequences are for your members of that delay, and I think you said it contributed to the already rising anxiety. Were there any other impacts on them other than that anxiety?
I think it also contributed to confusion. I think with different arrangements, by local authority, and even actually sometimes within different school communities, within single local authorities, it resulted in confusion amongst school staff members, but also resulted in confusion amongst parents, particularly if the provisions in a neighbouring local authority were somewhat different for school children in that area than they were in the one that their children went to school. So I think in the early stages of the pandemic, when everyone really was trying to make the cognitive leap to understand COVID, it was not helpful that there were these kind of organically developing variations and, you know, to our minds, not enough consultation at local level either with trade unions. So whilst COSLA within the SNCT space seemed reticent to get national agreements in place that would have helped everyone, we saw some replication of that within individual local authority negotiating spaces, and the reluctance on the part of some individual local authorities to ensure collaborative joint working around health and safety, when all the evidence shows that when employers work in that way with trade unions, everyone benefits from that. Everyone benefits from that.
Thank you. You say, I think in paragraph 20, you described that on Monday the 16th of March 2020, you were able to advise your members that agreement had been reached. But you say that there were still things missing from that agreement, and it was designed to clarify responsibilities and duties of teachers while schools remained open, but it didn't fully answer whether those who were, for example, pregnant or had underlying health conditions could elect to self-isolate. What, if anything, did EIS do to resolve that gap or that missing?
So we couldn't entirely resolve that. You know, we're not the employers of teachers, but what we did do was to try to reassure members that their health and safety had to be the paramount consideration, and that if they believed that they were at immediate risk by attending school, then they should indicate to their employer that they wished either a risk assessment with appropriate mitigations being put in place to enable them to work safely within school buildings, or that they were electing to work from home. But we weren't able to, guarantee that employers would look favourably upon that, either in terms of how they might be paid or in terms of how that might be viewed in respect of breach of contract or not. So there was huge uncertainty around how individual employers would handle that, and that meant that at local level our reps, as well as us lobbying or seeking to negotiate with COSLA as the umbrella body at national level, our local reps were very much engaged with individual local authority employers to try to get the best provisions for pregnant staff and those with vulnerabilities who were, you know, by this point extremely anxious about their safety.
Thank you. In paragraph 22, you mentioned that there were a number of other employment issues that the EIS sought to resolve to mitigate variation from one local authority to another, and one related to the definition of key workers, which is something the inquiry has heard quite a bit about. Could you elaborate on what the issue was with the key worker definition from the perspective of EIS and its members?
So we were cognisant of the fact that it took quite a while for there to be clarity around how the key worker provisions would apply to teachers. This is related quite strongly to the hub provision that was set up, again unprecedented type of education provision that required teachers to staff the hubs, and whilst the hub provision was being made available for the children of key workers, and rightly made available for, you know, the children of emergency workers, healthcare workers, shop workers and so on, in order that, you know, society could continue to function to some degree amidst the crisis. There was maybe a bit of slowness to come to a realisation that teachers who were providing that critical daily care and education to those children, if they had children of their own, would also require access to that to that type of provision for their children if they didn't otherwise have childcare provision in place. And it was very, very difficult for anyone really to have childcare provision in place that didn't take place within the environs of their own homes at that time, for all sorts of obvious reasons. So it was around that issue that quite detailed negotiation had to take place, and there was concern amongst our members about what would happen to them or what would happen to their children in the event that they volunteered to be teachers working in the hubs.
And you said it took a while for that realisation to dawn. Was that issue resolved ultimately in favour of your members?
Yes, that was resolved. I mean, like many of the issues, resolved because of the persistence of the EIS and the other teacher trade unions who were acting alongside us. I mean, typically the EIS was on the same page as the other trade unions around the need for very, very careful safety provisions and very, very considerate provisions around things like childcare, particularly given that the majority of teachers in Scotland are women, and unfortunately, the majority of caring responsibilities continue to fall to women.
Thank you. Just turning to the decision to close schools, on the 19th of March 2020, the Scottish Government issued a circular making it clear that the schools and local authority settings should close on the 20th of March 2020. You refer to that at paragraphs 27 to 32. Could you please just describe very briefly some of the challenges that last-minute decision-making had for EIS members, particularly given why it was particularly problematic given the demographic of your members?
So effectively, schools were given a day's notice of the closure of schools and early years provision. Now, across the country, teachers were probably, and head teachers were probably coming to the view that schools were going to have to close at some stage because of what was happening in other parts of the world, and it was probably and rightly inconceivable that things could have been exceptionally different in the UK and in Scotland. But it meant
Sorry, Ms. Bradley, I've just been asked to ask you if you could slow down a little bit. I think the stenographer is struggling to keep up.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
And just to add, thank you very much again. I forgot to thank you again for your very comprehensive statement. It will all be taken into account. So if we don't get to something,
Okay.
We've got it noted. So.
Okay. Right, I'll try to slow down. So although teachers and head teachers may have been anticipating closure and beginning to put some measures in place to ensure education continuity in the event of that happening, there was really only one working day's formal notice of that being the case, but that was going to be closure to pupils. So there was a scramble really over that short period of time to make sure that young people had everything that they needed to take home with them before they exited school buildings. By the end of that week, there was also the notification that hub schools were to be set up 8 days later. That wasn't even 8 working days later, and that was a type of education provision that had never before been used, so it was entirely unprecedented. And again, within a matter of only a few working days, teachers and head teachers had to think about what that could look like given the extremis of the circumstances that we were going to be in by that stage. So there was a massive amount of work put into that also. But school buildings were to remain open to staff for 1 week to enable all of that work around preparation for hub provision to be done. But there was insufficient outlining of what the safety mitigations would be over that week, whilst teachers were, allowed or enabled to access, in fact encouraged to be in school buildings, and we were looking for common sense health and safety provisions around that. But again, the internal machinations of COSLA hampered the progress towards an agreement like that being reached for teachers, and also around what was to happen in respect of teachers' employment and teachers' salaries when they did move to remote working. An agreement like that had been formulated for other local government workers a few days previously, but COSLA was reluctant to apply the same principles to the schools context because they wanted school staff to be more nimble than that. But the irony of that was that COSLA itself as an organisation couldn't have been described as agile or nimble in responding to the urgency of the safety, the situation and the health and safety considerations that were paramount in people's minds at that time. So the EIS issued guiding principles to members, again in the absence of nationally agreed guidance or a national agreement around those things. And again, there was a bit of, across different local authority areas, different expectations of what teachers were doing in that week between the closure of schools and the opening of hubs. Some local authorities and schools more or less mandated teacher attendance in school buildings. Other ones made more sensible provisions, saying that teachers should only be in schools for limited periods of time to do what was required in order to make the preparations, but not to be, in school from 9 till 4 o'clock every single day just for the sake of, being there. There was another dimension to that, in that teachers who were parents, their children were unable to attend school because schools closed that Friday, but there was an expectation that they attend schools themselves and limited options in terms of childcare provision for them. And again, the majority of people who were placed in that situation of facing that kind of dilemma were women, but there were some male colleagues, single fathers, who were also in that situation at that time. So again, a lot of unnecessary anxiety, dilemmas, problem solving that teachers had to undertake, as well as making this rapid transition to remote learning and this rapid transition to hub provision within a very short space of time.
Thank you. If we could turn now briefly just to discuss hub schools. What was EIS's understanding of the purpose of hub schools that were established in terms of what they intended to deliver and to whom?
So this was one means through which teachers and schools were going to ensure continuity of education, and it was for the children of key workers, so healthcare professionals, frontline healthcare professionals and emergency workers and shop staff, people who worked in grocery stores, and also children with certain vulnerabilities, so children for whom there might have been well-being concerns related to the home environment, and also children who had additional support needs of certain types that would have made remote learning for them much less of a viable proposition. So those were the young people for whom the provision was being made, and it spanned all age ranges. So from age 3 effectively up to age 18, although typically speaking, unless children had particular additional support needs, parents were more comfortable for older children to be at home. So that would be the parents of key workers, more comfortable for older children to be at home. It was probably more so younger children who did use them. And in terms of what they were supposed to provide, it was a degree of education continuity, but this was in a context whereby the teachers who were providing that education wouldn't necessarily know the children that they were teaching because they came from different areas, and there had to be a degree of realism about what could realistically be achieved, given that teachers didn't have relationships with those children. Many of them didn't know one another. So it was education, but not as we know it, education, but not as we know it. And there was a big emphasis on supporting the well-being of the children who attended hubs, in the understanding that they have been exposed to significant trauma as the days leading up to school closure unfolded. Media reports, they were able to, read newspapers and so on. They knew their parents were anxious, and particularly them being the children of key workers, they knew the kinds of circumstances that some of their parents were working in. So there was a significant well-being emphasis on what was provided through the hub context, as well as providing opportunities for young people to continue learning in, literacy, numeracy, other areas of the curriculum, but a strong well-being focus as well.
Thank you. And you say, I think at paragraphs 40 to 41, that you understood that they were required to provide a level of access to appropriate in-person learning and childcare to children of key workers and vulnerable children. So it wasn't just childcare, it was that education aspect,
Yes.
that in-person learning, as you said. You said, paragraph 41, in relation to the staffing of hubs, that the response from teachers to volunteer and ensure that there were sufficient numbers of teachers working within the hubs to meet demand was overwhelming. If it, in a particular, or do you know of any particular circumstances where if there were no volunteers for a particular hub, who would have been required to staff that?
I don't think that we ever were involved in discussions about what would have happened had there been, or which staff would have stepped in had there been insufficient numbers of teachers, because that didn't occur. We were clear with our members that we supported hub provision for the children in the groups that I've outlined. We indicated to members that we were supportive of them volunteering to staff hub provision if they felt that they were able to do that. We were clear that they shouldn't have felt under any compulsion to do so, and particularly not those with underlying health conditions or who were pregnant or who had vulnerable people at home and didn't feel that they could balance the risks sufficiently well. And we made all of that clear to the Scottish Government and COSLA, but we also made it clear that in the event that there were insufficient numbers of teachers volunteering, that the EIS would look to be assistive in helping that situation, but it never occurred. The feedback that we got from, certainly through our local association secretaries and through discussions on the COVID-19 Education Recovery Group, there was a plentiful supply of teachers volunteering to staff hubs, and that was done then on a rotated basis, so that teachers were not in hub provision. Well, it would have been rare for teachers to have been in hub provision every single day. It was kind of shared out amongst the plentiful number of volunteers that had come forward in each local authority area. So I'm not aware of there being a single incidence in any local authority where there was insufficient numbers of teachers to staff the setting.
Thank you. I won't stop on this. We'll need to move on, but you refer in paragraphs 41 and 42 to the fact that there was inconsistency across local authorities in terms of discussions around the arrangements necessary to open hub schools, and in terms of safety measures that were implemented across local hub schools, and you refer to a report titled Teaching During the COVID-19 Shutdown Survey Report, which I won't ask to be opened, but we'll touch on it later again. Could you briefly outline some of the concerns that the survey showed in terms of implementation of safety measures in hub schools specifically, just very broadly? Yeah.
So when we surveyed our members later that year, it was in the autumn of that year, it came to light that in a third of hub schools, there had been no risk assessment carried out, and that there were barely, if any, mitigations in place. And that was, for us, quite a worrying set of statistics. We also found, or I think we'd found even prior to conducting that survey, probably from report backs from our local association secretaries, that those really vital discussions at local level between trade unions and the representatives of the employers were not taking place to the extent that they needed to around health and safety in respect of hub provision. So that is something that was a matter of real concern. We were very clear at the outset that we were supportive of hub provision, but in terms of the local implementation of the kind of policy direction around that, there had to be close collaboration between trade unions and employers, and that didn't happen in all cases. It happened in many cases, but not in all cases.
Thank you. And just finally, in relation to hubs, you alluded to it earlier, just in relation to the challenges of meeting the needs of pupils. You referred to the fact that teachers were having to provide hub provision to pupils that they were not their own pupils necessarily. What were the key challenges for teachers and staff in terms of meeting the diverse needs of pupils attending those school hubs?
I think the issues that emanate from not having had time to build relationships, not having had time to build relationships in a context that was very strongly trauma-ridden for the young people who were attending hubs, not having knowledge of the additional support needs of some of the young people who were attending the hubs, and what kinds of provision would have been in place for those young people within their own school settings. To some extent, probably because of the context within which young people were attending, there could be behaviour challenges, young people struggling to social distance, to adhere to mitigations that were in place in some contexts, and yeah, I think that they were probably the main things. Some young people, particularly younger young people, struggling to understand how to follow the mitigations and why they needed to. So these were all issues that teachers would have faced to varying degrees, depending on the cohort that they were working with on any given day, and they had to be very quick thinking, use all of the kind of like the skills and knowledge that they had from their own professional experience, maybe try and learn from other colleagues about how they were responding to some of this, and just do their best in the moment to support the most pressing needs of the young people who were in front of them at any given time.
Thank you. I think we'll move on now to discuss some of the issues and impacts associated with remote teaching and learning. At paragraph 57, you again refer to that report, the Teaching During COVID-19 Shutdown Survey report, and you say that a full range of barriers were identified by members at the time can be accessed in that report. And at paragraphs 57 to 76, you discuss some of the particular barriers and challenges that were faced in the move to remote learning and teaching. You specifically flag, and we'll come on to discuss mental health and well-being type issues, but you specifically say, if we could focus now on some of the practical issues that were encountered, which I think you say the main sources of concerns for EIS members during that transition period related specifically to pupil participation and access to digital technology. Could I ask you please to outline some of the issues that arose in relation to both of those?
Okay, so focusing specifically on pupils and access to digital technology. Yeah. Because there were issues for teachers as well in that regard, but I'll talk about that in respect.
Well, it's fine. It's in respect to both. I suppose it's pupil participation, but from the perspective of the teacher, and then the access to digital technology can be either or both.
Yeah. Okay. So teachers flagged in that survey that pupil participation was not consistent, was not universal. So a teacher, let's say a primary teacher has a class of 33 children, it would have been rare for 33 children to be participating at all times in the learning for a variety of reasons, and one of those did relate to the reliance within the remote learning offer on digital technology. Now, again, schools had never provided this type of education previously, so there were all sorts of teething problems around that. Many teachers didn't have access to devices themselves. Their employers hadn't issued them devices. So if teachers had their own, or somebody in the house had a laptop, then they made use of it. Some teachers bought their own kit, you know, so that they were able to provide for their learners very quickly. But there were also issues across the country in terms of internet connectivity, and sometimes the difficulties around that were experienced by teachers. Sometimes the difficulties around that were experienced by young people, and sometimes both. So that could sometimes interrupt, you know, the sequences of learning that teachers had sought to provide for young people. In terms of access to digital devices amongst young people, we know that, you know, there's a digital divide in Scotland. There continues to be, and there certainly was at that time, where the poorest young people simply did not have within the home access to laptops, tablets, you know, even phones, in the numbers that would have been required for them to be able to be online all the time. An online you know, learning offer was being made by their teacher or their school. Those connectivity issues that I've talked about, some young people not having access to data, not having access to Wi-Fi, and actually some homes being so poor that there was issues around the availability of power to keep devices charged or to keep devices running in order that young people could participate in the learning. I mean, 64% of our members in that survey reported the you know, significant issues around there being insufficient access for young people to technology at home. So, you know, really quite a worrying statistic. So some schools prior to the pandemic had invested in laptops or invested in iPads and things like that, and they sent the kids home with them, you know, the day before schools closed. But not all schools had those, and not all schools had them for all their classes or all the particularly secondary schools where you've maybe got, you know, 1,500 pupils or 2,000 pupils, in some cases even more than that in some of the bigger schools. They simply did not have that number of devices to be able to issue to young people. So that was a problem right at the beginning, and we know that led to in some homes the sharing of devices between children. So if there were, say, 3-4 kids in the home, they each got a turn on a laptop or the phone or whatever it was over the course of the day, and sometimes, you know, the child's turn didn't coincide with when a particular offering, you know, was being made by the child's school. So that was, you know, that was very problematic. And actually many children don't have designated workspaces at home, you know, a desk, somewhere comfortable to sit in order to be able to carry out just regular schoolwork. You know, never mind, you know, what was required in order to enable them to engage in learning that involved video, camera, you know, direct communication with the teacher and their peers in a virtual classroom setting. So there are all sorts of practical issues around that. There are other issues linked to pupil participation, if you want me to.
Please.
Yeah. I mean, from our point of view, you know, we were very clear from the outset, and we were kind of echoed by Education Scotland on this, that virtual learning can in no way replicate what happens in school buildings when young people are with their teachers face to face and the other adults who support them in schools face to face, and when they're with their peer group. You know, schools are very rich, complex social environments, and what kids derive emotionally and socially from schools are, you know, absolutely, you know, it's absolutely fundamental to the progress of their learning. Many young people simply didn't enjoy sitting on a screen, you know, for several hours a day, or even if they weren't involved in live learning on a screen, sitting, you know, typing in things, you know, for a piece of work and then sending it to their teacher. They didn't enjoy that experience to the same degree as they would had they been participating in a group setting, you know, in real time, working with their peers and working with their teacher and getting all the, you know, the kind of the benefits of the dynamics of all of that. And I think that impacted, we know that impacted pupil morale fairly quickly. We know that the mental health impact of the pandemic was significant. We know that many young people were being bereaved, and you know, they were struggling to cope. Families struggling to cope with bereavement. amidst the confines and constrictions of the pandemic. And we know that a shocking number of children in Scotland were living in poverty before the pandemic struck, and for many of them the impacts of that intensified over the COVID period. And from work that Education Scotland did later, they conducted an equity audit looking at the equity impacts of the pandemic. One of the things that the poorest children worried about was not their participation in schoolwork, not their ability to keep up with their peers in schoolwork. They were most acutely concerned about the impact of the pandemic and the risk of coronavirus to their family members, who had health vulnerabilities or who were elderly. And we know that disproportionate numbers of the poorest in our communities died or were made seriously ill by COVID-19. So that's understandable that young people were really worried about that, and more worried about that than perhaps keeping up with the latest lesson. Also, a significant number of young people, it came to light during the pandemic, had caring responsibilities for disabled parents who were struggling with mental health, parents who were struggling with addiction, and they also had caring responsibilities for siblings. A lot of these children, their parents didn't have the option of home working, or they may have had the option of home working, but couldn't do that and also look after younger children. So some of the responsibility for that fell to older children, and they were maybe less able to devote the number of hours in the day that we might have wished to keep up and to participate in their schoolwork.
Thank you. I think we'll now turn to discuss some of the other issues and impacts experienced during school closures, in particular those relating to human rights, mental health and well-being, which you discuss at paragraphs 65 to 69 of your witness statement. If we could start perhaps just a general impact due to working from home that you touch on. What were some of the sorts of factors that impacted on members' well-being when working from home, just as a matter of course?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that the vast majority of teachers did not enjoy working from home. I think they actually found it incredibly stressful. I think some of them found it quite traumatic, to the point where they struggled to use technology when they went back into school settings, because it was quite triggering of the really difficult experience that they'd had working from home, and that featured long hours. Very, very long hours, and the inability to switch off and disconnect from school, from school-related work, because as well as teaching lessons during the day, they were also spending hours of time preparing lessons. They were doing so with technology that they were largely unfamiliar with, because they'd never had to do this kind of thing before, and so everything took longer. They were trying to provide feedback to young people. They were doing well-being checks on young people, and so they found that the number of hours that they would spend typically per working day were being stretched and stretched and stretched. And it was not uncommon to learn of teachers working 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 hours a day, and that was particularly the case for senior leaders who were trying to effectively manage remote schools, virtual schools, support all of the staff to deliver this unprecedented form of learning for young people, take full account of the well-being needs of individual young people and their families and respond to them as best they could, despite the restrictions, and help to allay fears of families, young people, etc. So there was an immense emotional and practical pressure on head teachers in particular. Teachers also reported not enjoying the sedentariness of home working, sitting at a computer for hours a day, either doing live lessons or providing feedback electronically. Teachers move around a lot, they interact a lot with young people. It's a very kind of physical job normally. They also talked about the isolation of working at home. Teachers work very collaboratively with their colleagues in school settings, and although there was a kind of second best, if you like, set up of Teams groups and things like that, WhatsApp groups set up, that didn't really, substitute for that staff room chat at lunchtime, or in the corridor chat, you know, between lessons, or walking into school buildings or out of them at the end of the day. So they talked about the isolation that came from home working. They didn't like, many of them, the disruption to their usual routines. As everyone knows, school environments are very, you know, they're very someone might say quite rigid, you know, everything's very timed. There are bells, not always bells in schools these days, but everyone knows where they're going to be, at which time, and if not entirely what they're going to be doing, broadly what they're going to be doing at any given time. So disruption to routine. Many teachers, men and women, but particularly women, were trying to balance work, you know, the demands and pressures of work in very difficult circumstances with urgent caring responsibilities for not only children that they had at home whose learning also had to be supported, but vulnerable family members. And again, that responsibility falls disproportionately to women. So women in particular were doing hours and hours of paid work and unpaid work in the course of those days during school closures. So a really difficult set of circumstances in which teachers were trying to do their best to keep education going, and they did quite a good job of that, I would say, considering the challenges that they faced.
Thank you. And in relation to workload specifically, I think you've touched on it already. In paragraph, I think starting at 74, you talk about the blurring of working hours with expectations they would respond to messages about teaching and learning on social media, and that all took a toll on their health. What support, if any, was made available via Education Scotland?
I think in the early stages of the pandemic, not a lot. There wasn't a lot of. I mean, there was a one of the work streams of the COVID education recovery group was focused on workforce support and the well-being of teachers, but I would say that, you know, it took quite a while for there to have been any tangible outputs from that. So at this point in the and even then they were insufficient, you know, they were insufficient. But at this stage in the pandemic there wasn't a lot of support going directly to teachers other than that which they received from their own colleagues. There was no real support coming from national agencies in that regard, so the EIS stepped in order to provide that kind of support for our members. We provided them guidance on looking after their own well-being, you know, encouraging them to be cognizant of the very, you know, strained context within which they were working, encouraging them to take breaks, encouraging them not to, you know, to work endless hours in the day, to make sure that they were building in sufficient recovery time at the end of each day and at weekends in order that they could sustain what they were trying to provide for young people. So we provided guidance, we provided professional learning, we put together a whole series of professional learning for our members around wellbeing. It was called Our Wellbeing Matters, and you know, that was very well received by our members. But I'm not aware of, and the other thing that we did was signpost them to lots of websites and you know, other places that were already available where they could go for immediate wellbeing support. But we felt that there perhaps wasn't the national agency response to the wellbeing needs of teachers that there needed to be in the earlier stages of the pandemic, particularly.
Thank you. You also talk about anxieties, and you describe paragraph 72, and I think this is probably, again, similar to what you'd heard as we're moving into school closures, but you describe how 20% of the respondents said they had an underlying physical or mental health condition that put them more at risk of COVID-19, and they were anxious and concerned about returning to the classroom before it was safe to do so. And then you also talk in paragraph 76 about the heightened state of anxiety on top of increased workload was unmanageable and unsustainable for members. Then you also have, later on in your statement, under paragraph 84 to 85, under the heading Anxiety about Education Continuity, you have a paragraph about that. What specifically were members' concerns and reasons for this in relation to education continuity specifically?
So I think that we're maybe talking here, well, I'm maybe talking general terms. I mean, members, you know, perceived that the crisis was not being well enough managed at a national level, and that made them feel I think maybe more fearful than they might otherwise have felt. And for some, that anxiety exacerbated pre-existing physical and mental health conditions. So when people are stressed, and when people have got too many unknowns to contend with, then that impacts mental health. And for some of our members, it also worsened physical conditions that that otherwise might have been relatively well held under control. There were members with specific disabilities, who worried about their safety in the event that schools were to reopen and there was insufficiency of safety mitigations, remembering that had been their experience before schools closed, and they didn't have certainty that things would be different when schools reopened. And there was also the fact that members were acutely aware of what was happening within the UK, daily the death toll increasing, daily the number of hospitalisations increasing, and that was in Scotland as well. We had no vaccine at that time, so members were very well aware of that. But they were concerned about themselves, but they were concerned about the ongoing impact of this crisis provision on the experiences of young people. And at this point in the year, March time, particularly on the senior phase learners who were soon to, under normal circumstances, would have been undertaking, many of them undertaking exams or otherwise final pieces of assessment to enable them to acquire qualifications that, for many of them are very important for them getting to the next stage of their learner journey or into employment or college, university, or into the workplace. So they were concerned about that. So I think there was, for many members, a real dilemma. They had that strong sense of professional concern and responsibility for learners, and knew the importance of being at school and in school buildings for them, but also I suppose just that instinctive need to protect themselves and their families, and that was particularly so where people were aware of particular health vulnerabilities that they had. So that was really, really difficult for many of them.
Thank you. And just finally, public pressure. You mentioned public pressure in paragraph 73. Could you please just summarise what that public pressure was and how it affected teachers?
So I think probably somewhat symptomatic of the fact that the UK, is entrenched in a long hours culture. There can be a common misperception regarding the nature of teachers' work, that it begins at 9 o'clock in the morning and finishes at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, which of course, is fallacy. Teachers are contracted for 35 hours per week, but the reality is that on average they work 46. So 11 of those hours are unpaid, but that's not well understood by members of the public or certain sections of the media, and not well understood, it would seem, by some politicians either. There's also a perception that teachers get lots of holidays. Schools are closed for 12 weeks of the year, but teachers are not paid for all of those 12 weeks of closure. That's not well understood either, but nonetheless I think there's a kind of general perception that teachers, comparative to other workers who are trapped in this long hours culture, have got it easy. So there were some sections of the media and some politicians perhaps, and some pressure groups, who were very active at the time, who were of the view that teachers shouldn't have been working from home at all, and they wished to apply pressure, to government and probably local authority level to force different decisions than had been taken around the closure of schools. So teachers were aware of that, and I think that when teachers read things like that appear in the media or on social media, they were that impacted their morale quite badly. They knew how much they were straining to keep education going for young people, how much they were doing, and yet they were being cast by some as lazy, not contributing well enough to the collective effort around the crisis, and that was just not true to say at all. The other thing to say is that, while that was the view of some, thousands of parents during the months of school closure and when schools reopened were clear about the lengths that teachers went to ensure quality provision for their children during lockdown and afterwards, to ensure quality education for their children. And I think that thousands of parents maybe had a stronger sense of how difficult and complex a job being a teacher is, because of the experience that they had in trying to support their own children's learning at home. So while there was that sort of maybe more in the right-wing media, that sort of castigating of teachers, I think that was strongly counterbalanced by the deep appreciation that there was amongst thousands of parents and other sections of society of the work that teachers did over that period.
Thank you. And just before we move off from impacts, you discuss in your statement in various places, but it's 65 to 68, and then again at paragraphs 414 to 429, disproportionate impacts on particular groups of workers and the support that EIS provided to them. You talk generally about those facing inequality and women, and then disproportionate impacts, for example, on minority ethnic teachers, women, disabled and pregnant. Would you mind, please, just briefly outlining what the specific issues were for those four groups, so minority ethnic, women, disabled and pregnant teachers, please, and what you did to support them?
In the relatively early stages of the pandemic, it became clear that people belonging to certain ethnic groups appeared to be at greater risk of serious illness and death from COVID than the general population who didn't share those same characteristics. And our black ethnic and black, Asian and minority ethnic members grew really concerned about that. So the EIS provided specific advice to those members and to the reps who were supporting them around bespoke risk assessment and the kinds of considerations that there should be for enhanced mitigations to protect those particular groups of workers. In respect of disabled teachers, there was, for some of them, not all, for some of them, the experience of not being granted reasonable adjustments at home, the kind of which they would have had they been working in normal school environments. And in terms of the support that we gave to them, that would have been at local level with local reps, perhaps intervening directly with a head teacher or negotiating with a local authority to ensure that if a member is entitled to reasonable adjustments in the workplace, then those reasonable adjustments apply regardless of the workplace in which they happen to be at any given time. I mean, obviously, there might have been minor adaptations to take account of home working in comparison to working in a busy school environment, but nonetheless, some disabled members, were left struggling without reasonable adjustments while working at home. And even when we were talking about in-school environments and changes were being made to take account of the risks, there maybe wasn't sufficient equality impact assessment of what those changes might mean for disabled teachers in that environment. So they had to somewhat strain to adapt rather than there be, by design, consideration given to the needs of disabled teachers in physical environments or navigating physical environments. So, for example, teachers with visual impairment, would be one example there. And women, I think it's kind of, as I've touched on previously, the amount of work that women were doing at home and for school, to support education continuity. But we know from a project that we did called 1,000 Women's Voices that the levels of mental health distress amongst women in particular were really high. Now, to some extent, the women who participated in that work self-elected, so you could say, well, perhaps they did that because they were already feeling the strain and the stress and so wanted to express that, and it was good that we gave them the opportunity to do that. But what was worrying for us was that the levels of mental distress that were being reported through that work were 30% higher for women teachers than for other groups of women. So that we felt that was significant. And the other thing, in addition to the majority of the teacher demographic being women, there are particular groups of teachers where women are even more heavily represented, and for example early years teachers who are the vast majority, you're in the high 90% are women. And the feeling was that, and the reality was actually that for different reasons they were the least well protected by the mitigations that were put in place within the various sets of guidance. Early years, for example, as a provision, was the last to close and the first to reopen, with the least protection in place. No social distancing from children in the early years setting, and in fact, early years teachers were actively discouraged from distancing from small children, and in fact encouraged to cuddle them, to provide reassurance to them, and for teachers, this seemed really counterintuitive to all the rest of the advice that was being given, and to what all the rest of the evidence seemed to be saying about contraction of COVID-19 and the risks therein. But there was a sense that it was their duty, their professional duty, to provide that comfort, and even a reticence on the part of employers initially to enable early years teachers to wear masks or face coverings while doing all that. So, in busy environments, last to close, least strength of mitigations, and all the dilemmas and associated worries that that go along with that. And it was similar for teachers, women teachers working in ASN provision, because again there's an even disproportionately higher number of women who work within additional support needs settings too, where young people struggled to understand social distancing, or their needs were so complex that they required intimate personal care, or they required an adult right beside them in close proximity, helping them to manage certain physical, actions, or to be able to do certain things physically. And teachers in those settings felt that they wanted to put the needs of the young people ahead of their own. But they knew that carried significant risk to them. So there was a whole lot of emotional strain that went around, that went along with that for them.
Thank you. And then I suppose pregnant women are self-explanatory because they were vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. And different advice or different application of the advice across different local authorities. And of course, it is not good for pregnant women to be under undue stress. And had there been, just proper national provision around that was universally applied across all 32 local authorities, and within all 32 local authorities, so much of that stress could have been alleviated.
Thank you. I think if we can move on now just briefly to touch on reopening of schools in August 2020 and the issues around that, certainly in the preparation for that. I think in paragraph 96, there's a sense of déjà vu. You say that you state that the indecision, delays and prevarication experienced around the closure of schools was replicated in the planning for schools reopening between April and August 2020. And then you, in paragraph 97, refer to the impact on members' workload and mental health and well-being arising from decisions by the Scottish Government and the changes to their planning assumptions in the period prior to schools reopening. And then you go on to address what was involved specifically in relation to planning for blended learning. Could you please discuss or just briefly outline EIS's perspective on the challenges that this presented, this planning for move to blended learning?
So that was a period of deep uncertainty, having to kind of guess or anticipate what the direction from government might be, making provision for all scenarios, plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, massive amount of work. At this point, of course, schools were still closed and were providing remote learning for young people, and many teachers and head teachers were supporting hub provision as well. So there were 2 other forms of education provision underway at that time, and we've already touched on the kind of workload implications of that. But on top of that, then there had to be planning for, you know, different arrangements, and the planning assumption, because of the direction that the Scottish Government seemed to be taking, was that there would be blended learning in August. So in schools, teachers and head teachers were reorganising timetables to minimise the number of interactions that there might be between pupils. They were moving furniture, they were rearranging classrooms, they were thinking about the kinds of safety mitigations that might need to be in place. They were thinking about curricular provision for in-person learning in classrooms, and then what young people might do at home. So a massive amount of planning around the curriculum, as well as the, you know, the practical planning that had to be in place in order to facilitate particularly the in-person learning within school buildings. So that was the planning assumption. With very short notice, there was an announcement that school buildings would be open to teachers to enable them to refine planning around all of that. Again, there was no clarity as to what kinds of safety mitigations would be in place while teachers might be in school buildings to assist that work. So, you know, EIS stepped in, creating guidance to support members in that situation. You know, there was, you know, very, very intricate planning underway locally around all of that. But to a large extent, those were wasted efforts, because 2 days before the end of term, before the end of the summer term, there was the announcement that the planning assumption should change, and that the assumption now should be full reopening of schools to all students, all ages and stages, you know, if infection levels were sufficiently low on the 11th of August. So the announcement of that U-turn came without warning or consultation whatsoever, not within the SERG group, and not within not with any individual trade union, certainly not with the EIS as the largest trade union supporting the biggest number of members, and you know, critically, there was no scientific evidence provided to justify such a change in direction. And you know, EIS members though did note that the UK government was also planning for reopening in September, and they were more than aware of the public pressure that was being applied by pressure groups like Us For Them and some other individuals to force school reopening, and that decision and the way that it was taken without consultation led to strengthening of perceptions that COVID safety for teachers was somewhat at the whim of political expediency, rather than being, you know, a paramount consideration. So there was, you know, huge amounts of stress and anxiety associated with that. Head teachers in particular barely had a summer break. I mean, they had effectively been working non-stop since the previous January. They didn't have really a spring break because of all the work that they were doing in support of education continuity. And then their summer break was significantly curtailed because of the announcement that was made there, because they had to go back into school buildings, often with colleagues, to undo all of that practical work that had been done to support, you know, the spreading out of kids and smaller class sizes, you know, to ensure everyone's safety. So to be honest, I mean, head teachers were exhausted anyway by the time that announcement was made, and they were practically on their knees by the time schools reopened in the earlier part of August. Yeah, and that was something that was reported quite strongly to us through our head teacher network channels, and we did a particular piece of survey work with head teachers, you know, that kind of reiterated a lot of the concerns that we were hearing through the network. So yeah, that was a really difficult time for teachers and particularly school leaders.
Thank you. Just one final question about reopening before we move on to the next topic. In paragraph 140, you refer to the fact that as pupils gradually return to schools, the EIS collated evidence from members about the processes that and concerns were quickly noted, and you go on to give examples of, for example, no enhanced cleaning inadequate supplies of hand sanitizer, a lack of signage in schools, no guidance on the size of staff meetings, etc. In relation specifically to the issues of no enhanced cleaning and inadequate supplies of hand sanitizer, how widespread, or are you aware of how widespread that issue was?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was fairly commonly reported from the various local associations. I mean, obviously, hand sanitizer was being recommended. You know, hand washing, hand sanitisation was being recommended as a key mitigation, but there was still at that point scarcity. There were issues with supply of sanitizer to schools, but not only that. Pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, no hot water in school bathrooms, and insufficient provision of soap. These are basic health and safety provisions that should have been in place anyway and always as a matter of course. But even during the height of the pandemic, they were in short supply, and at a time when we were trying to get schools back or the government was trying to get schools back and fully functioning, but without there being even those most basic of mitigations or provisions to support one of the kind of critical mitigations at that time. So yeah, teachers were concerned about that, in addition to some of the other examples that you outlined there.
And just briefly, in terms of what members were saying about this, what were they doing to address this? For example, were they saying they had to supply their own, or they just weren't using?
I think teachers were buying their own hand sanitizer where they could and bringing it into classrooms and dotting it around the room, so that there was some supply of it. But that would have been, some teachers doing that, not all teachers doing that. So a bit of a mixed picture from our point of view. Teachers shouldn't have had to do that. That was an essential bit of kit at that point in the pandemic, and really should have been. There should have been certainty of provision of that before schools were reopening in full by that stage. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll just turn now briefly. I'm just conscious we only have 15 minutes left and a lot to discuss. Just briefly on the balancing of harms and the four harms approach and the Scottish Government's approach. I'd like to ask you just a couple of questions about that. I think you discuss the balance of harms approach in a couple of places through your statement, including at paragraphs 127 to 129 and at paragraph 224. What concerns specifically did EIS have about the balance of harms approach adopted by the Scottish Government and Public Health Scotland in their decision making?
So the EIS didn't have any specific policy on the balance of harms as a framework. We didn't critique it. We didn't sort of like develop any policy around that per se. But our members, and I would also say that it was not particularly well communicated to school staff. So our members didn't have a particularly strong perception that a balance of harms approach was being applied. But in officers and officials looking at it, because we had access to documentation that was in draft around guidance, etc., and we were in meetings where the balance of harms approach was being talked about almost all of a sudden at one stage. Our view, and certainly the view of our members, was that in all the considerations that were being made about education and how education should run and what kinds of measures should be in place to ensure safety, they did not feel that their immediate health and safety as workers was being given appropriate priority. And we didn't have policy on the balance of harms per se, but we are very clear that a policy framework such as that to help inform decision making doesn't trump the law when it comes to health and safety at work. It can't trump the law. Doesn't displace health and safety legislation and the legal duty of employers to safeguard the health and safety of their employees. That has to be of paramount and critical importance. And it was certainly paramount for us and for the 50,000 teachers that we were representing, school teachers that is, at the time, and of course the young people that they were teaching, because teachers were obviously concerned about their own safety, that of their families, but they were also concerned about the safety of the children that they were working with, the children and young people that they were working with, particularly when so many of those young people had health vulnerabilities or their family members did, and particularly in primary contexts. primary teachers are very well aware of the, you know, the wider health and social needs of whole families. So, you know, teachers at that time had a deep fear of being infected, you know, by this unpredictable virus. Many had underlying health conditions. Even those with no underlying health conditions knew how quickly the virus could turn when it took hold in a person who otherwise was healthy. People with disabilities, people from certain ethnic groups, pregnant women, they all had particularly heightened anxieties. And of course, these were rational fears. These were not irrational fears. These were rational fears based on what was happening in the UK, what was happening in Scotland by that point on a daily basis. And we articulated these fears in meetings. EIS did that on behalf of members, but it seemed that government and employers defaulted at the time, you know, time after time, to stress the primacy of the educational needs of children and young people, and they downplayed the risks to staff, and our members very much, you know, they very much felt that. And it's also important to say that EIS members wanted schools to be open. They wanted schools to be open. They understood the educational and social impacts of schools being closed. They cared about children, young people and families, but they needed to feel safe at work and weren't. They needed to feel safe at work and didn't, and they needed to be safe at work and they weren't sufficiently safe at work, because when you look at the data around that, teachers were in the 4th highest group of professionals to contract COVID-19. And for us, the logic of that was that although they might not have been amongst the highest groups to be hospitalised or to die from COVID-19, that vulnerability to infection would also place them at higher risk of contraction of long COVID, and that's still an issue that's being looked at, that we are campaigning around now. You know, anecdotally, we know that there's a significant number of teachers suffering from long COVID.
So on that, Ms Bradley, what do you think the impacts are, if any, for your members of the approach that the Scottish Government took to the 4 harms approach, or to the balancing of harms?
I think an overriding feeling that they didn't matter so much, that they didn't matter enough, and that other things mattered more, that perhaps political, economic, considerations around childcare mattered more than they did as people who have families of their own, people with underlying health conditions and vulnerabilities of their own, and who also had family members, you know, at home with those kinds of vulnerabilities. I mean, like, if you're a secondary teacher of English or maths, say, with classes of 30 or 33 each time, and you teach 6 classes a day, just in teaching your classes, you're interacting in a tight classroom space with 200 young people a day. And over the course of a week, that's 1,000 different interactions, because those young people will also have been in contact, you know, with others, so that their status potentially changes. And then there are all the corridor interactions, the dining room interactions. So teachers, you know, were well aware of the risks and the intensity of the risks, but they did not feel that those risks were being taken, and the fear that they felt around those were being taken seriously enough by national or local government.
And although EIS didn't have a policy in relation to the balancing of harms, what does it believe the balance of harms approach should be, or how it should be addressed in the event of another pandemic, or doesn't it?
So, in the event of another pandemic, I mean, I think it's absolutely right to have an expansive view of the impacts of a public health crisis. Of course, you have to have that, but in seeking to respond to it and to keep service provision going, you have to give paramount importance to the health and safety of the people who are going to be delivering that service, and then other things can be considered afterwards. But that has to have primacy, and it has to have primacy because the law is otherwise there to supposedly to ensure that. The other thing to say is that the balance of harms approach could have worked differently, given that school buildings being closed did not mean that education would stop, or school buildings having a blended learning approach operating within them didn't mean that learning would stop. Education wouldn't have stopped. There was other means by which education could have been and was being provided for young people, and so it wasn't the be-all and the end-all for school buildings to be open, although nobody is contesting that is the optimum. That's the optimum, but from our point of view, you can only have that optimum in practice if the risks are sufficiently low or the risks are sufficiently well handled, and in the views of our members, substantiated by the the wealth of data that we have around that, they weren't.
Just finishing off on this point, in the context of Omicron, in paragraph 229, you say that the whole narrative around priorities in schools left your teachers and school staff with the perception that their health and well-being was not a key consideration in the assessment of risk, even in the light of a more transmissible strain of the virus. It's a similar concern to one you've articulated already. And you then go on in paragraphs 230 to 233, with reference to your discussion of the critical national infrastructure, to say that the perception by teachers and school staff that their health and well-being was not a key considering in the assessment of risk was reinforced by the inclusion of education in the critical national infrastructure exemption scheme. We don't have time to go into that and what it was, and we've got your statement, but just based on information given to EIS by its members, is it possible to say whether and to what extent teaching and other educational staff in Scotland might have felt under pressure to go to work, even in circumstances where they might not have been feeling well? Was that a consideration or not?
Well, that was certainly our worry, that that teachers would feel with a provision like that they were being encouraged not to abide by the guidance that was in place otherwise, and to go into school. And they were cognizant of the large numbers of their colleagues who were off at any given time. Sometimes we were talking more than 1,500 teachers off, because of COVID infection. And teachers knew the strain that schools were under to keep education going with so many staff absences. And whether they did it explicitly or not, school leaders and local authorities would have felt quite desperate, I think, in a lot of the circumstances, and the teachers would have felt emotional pressure, I think, to maybe abandon or somewhat disregard the measures that were otherwise in place to keep others safe, in order that there would be sufficient levels of staffing to keep schools open. So that was another hideous dilemma that many had to grapple with, and from our point of view, it was one that should never have been put. It was one that should never have been put to them. The idea that you can volunteer to opt out of essential safety mitigations, we didn't think that was really sound rationale in the first place, and we advised our members that they should not feel whatsoever compelled to attend school if they had been identified as a close contact, or if they had felt that they were not fully recovered from COVID-19, and to alert a rep in the circumstance that they did feel that they were being put under pressure to attend. Thank you.
I just have a quick question or two in relation to reopening of schools in February 2021, and specifically around the campaign for vaccination of staff working in the education sector. You say in paragraph 195, you refer to the fact that vaccination of school staff was a key campaigning objective of. What was the EIS's position on the vaccination of school staff as a key campaigning objective? What were you seeking to achieve?
Yeah. So it's a bit like, this speaks a little bit to the question around the balance of harms as well. So if you wanted to apply the balance of harms in the way that was being suggested by the Scottish Government in particular, then you had to really max up on the mitigations within school buildings given the levels of infection at the time. And in order for there to be in-school, in-person education continuity, you had to have sufficient numbers of teachers able to provide that, but we had huge numbers of teachers ill with COVID because they hadn't been vaccinated. So we said that a major component of a strategy like that should be the priority vaccination of teachers. And we said that in cognizance of the vaccination capacity that we had in Scotland at the time, which was the ability to issue 400,000 vaccinations a week, with a teaching workforce of 50,000, we could have vaccinated practically every teacher in Scotland in a matter of days, and that would have given them personal protection in terms of going into schools, you know, lesser risk of damage being done by COVID-19, but also would have helped to control the levels of infection that clearly were emanating from school buildings being open in the way that they were, without there being either sufficient mitigations in place or inability of young people, for whatever reason, or unwillingness in some cases of young people to adhere to those mitigations. So we thought that that was a kind of, you know, no-brainer really, you know, a really kind of straightforward thing that could have been done, but we never won on that one. We never got anywhere really with that one. So at the same time, we were pushing for clinical grade masks. We were pushing for improved ventilation and the provision of the provision of CO2 monitors and the appropriate actions being taken when CO2 levels reached a certain level, and so on, and all sorts of other mitigations to help protect people. But we didn't ever get agreement that teachers should have priority vaccination, although we did get it in the earlier phase of the vaccination rollout programme for additional support needs teachers, because of the intimate care and the close proximity that they might have been in respect of support for and you know, providing education to young people with particular additional support needs. So we thought that the approach in phase 2 should really have followed that common sense approach that was taken in phase 1, albeit after the EIS had pushed very strongly for it.
Thank you very much. We have less than a minute to go, and I am not touched colleges, but we have your statement, thank you very much, which is comprehensive, so we'll take that into account. You have 1 minute left. If I could ask you to, are there any particular lessons to be learned? We do have your lessons to be learned in your statement from paragraph 501 to 521, but if there are any particular ones that you want to flag up and draw to His Lordship's attention, please do that now.
Okay, I think what became very quickly apparent with the onset of COVID was that our education system was not resilient enough to cope, and I think that we need to respond now to make sure that in the event of another public health emergency like that one, or something else that caused that kind of disruption to education, that we're not in the same set of circumstances. So an agreement of a template national approach now in the event of another pandemic or form of system-wide disruption occurring, with leadership from the Scottish Government and national bodies, critically in partnership with trade unions, so that we can agree what would be the swift national response in the event of something like that happening. And for that to occur, there has to be trust in trade unions as the representative professional and industrial voice of teachers, and that requires our culture change, and we require that pretty urgently. You know, we've got a whole framework around fair work. We need to enact that. We need to enact that in full. We need a set of principles that are co-created that would underpin a national framework that could be enacted in the event that we need it. We need those principles to take cognizance that business as usual will not be possible or indeed desirable amidst such a crisis. And even when we get to the early stages of education recovery, business as usual can't be an option. The principles must take full account of equity and equality considerations, take account of the demographic of the workforce, and respond to all of the needs of that, that particular demographic, and build all of that into the design of any framework and the underpinning principles, rather than do it as add-ons later under emergency crisis conditions. And within that framework, health, safety and the immediate well-being has to be the priority. The immediate well-being of workers, school staff, has to be the priority, as is the law, above all other less pressing considerations. They're important considerations, but of course they are, but they're less pressing considerations. Protection of life and health, with extra considerations of particular vulnerabilities, has to be the kind of the ultimate and the first priority. And I think if we did that, so many of the other things that I've talked about would naturally flow from that. And I think that as a country, we would be much more able to respond. Investment in education now, sufficient numbers of teachers, class size reduction, proper ASN provision, free school meals provision, and a cash-first approach in the event that school meals provision is not able to happen. If all of these things were done now, then we wouldn't be under such duress, in very difficult circumstances and under very, tight time constraints in the future. So much preparatory work could be done now, and I think trust in teacher professional judgment at the chalk face, if you like, also a really critical factor of that. So I think that we need culture change as well as resources at all stages and at all sections of our education system in order that we are much more resilient than we were first time around. But I would just also finish by saying that the effort of schools and teachers and other members of school staff was colossal from the beginning of the pandemic and continues to be today, because they are still very much navigating the impacts of it and trying to steer their way towards some kind of education recovery without sufficient resource to do so.
Thank you very much, Ms Bradley. My Lord, we've gone slightly over 3 minutes over. I have no further questions unless your Lordship does.
No, I've got no further questions. Thank you, Ms van der Westhuizen. Thank you, Ms Bradley. That's all. We'll come back at 1:30.